Richard's laughter echoed through the glass walls of the conference room on the 50th floor. It was a dry, cutting sound that seemed to make the air-conditioned room even colder. He threw the sketch onto the table with calculated contempt, watching the sheet slide to the edge and almost fall onto the immaculate floor. Standing before him was Lily, a 19-year-old girl in a gray cleaning uniform that was slightly too big for her shoulders. She kept her head down, clutching her rag so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The silence that followed the laughter was heavy and suffocating, broken only by the sound of the torrential rain punishing New York City outside, turning the headlights on Fifth Avenue into blurred streaks of red and white. Richard loosened his silk tie, glanced at the gold watch on his wrist, and sighed, as if the girl's mere presence was an insult to his precious time. It was then that he said the phrase that would be branded onto Lily's soul like a hot iron, a phrase that would echo for years until fate demanded its due. With a sneer full of the arrogance that only absolute power and a lack of empathy can build, he said, "You'll never get it, girl. You have no background, you have no education, and honestly, you probably don't even know how to read these blueprints you dared to pull out of the trash. Go back to your bucket and leave the engineering to those born to command." Lily felt her face burn, a mixture of shame and silent anger rising in her throat. But she said nothing. She simply gathered her cleaning supplies, swallowed the cry that was burning in her chest, and left the room, once again hearing the hoarse laughter of the most powerful man in the country's construction industry. As Lily walks down the long, cold corridor, holding back her tears, I want to invite you who are here with me now to calm down. Pull up a chair, turn up the volume, and tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching this story from today? Whether from a small town or a big city, your company is fundamental to us. And if you like stories that touch the soul and show that what goes around comes around, make sure you are subscribed to the channel. Here we believe that the sun rises for everyone, even after the darkest nights. Richard Harrison was not just a rich man, he was an institution. Owner of Harrison Developments, he had shaped the city's skyline with mirrored skyscrapers and luxury condos that cost more than an ordinary worker would earn in 10 lifetimes. He prided himself on being a self-made man. Although the truth was a little more complex, and he had conveniently forgotten the hands that helped him climb the first steps. At 55, Richard lived in a penthouse on the Upper East Side, surrounded by works of art he didn't understand but knew were worth millions. His life was a succession of commercial victories and personal failures. He had been divorced 3 times. His children spoke ill of him, except when they needed to ask for an allowance increase, and his friends were actually partners or subordinates who feared his explosive temper. Richard believed that competence was the only currency that mattered. He despised weakness, doubt, and above all, poverty. To him, poverty was a character flaw, a failure of ambition. He looked at his workers at the base, the bricklayers, the carpenters, the security guards, as replaceable gears, parts of a machine he operated with mastery. He didn't know anyone's name and was proud of it. "I am not paid to make friends. I am paid to build empires," he used to say in motivational speeches where tickets cost an arm and a leg. But behind that titanic facade, Richard was facing the biggest challenge of his career. The Infinity Project, a residential tower promising to be the tallest and most innovative in North America, was in trouble. Serious trouble. The soil where the foundation was being excavated presented an instability that none of his engineers, trained at the best Ivy League universities, could solve without blowing the budget by billions. There was an unmapped geological fault, a surprise from nature threatening to sink Richard's dream of glass and steel into the mud before it even rose. Meetings were tense, filled with shouting and resignations. Richard spent his nights awake, drinking aged whiskey and staring at the building's model illuminated in the center of his living room, feeling for the first time in decades the bitter taste of fear. The fear of failure, the fear of becoming a joke, the fear of losing his throne. On the other side of the city, in a small 2-room apartment in Queens where the paint was peeling and the subway took forever to arrive, Lily came home from her exhausting shift. She carefully took off her gray uniform, washed her face in the small bathroom sink, and went to the kitchen table where her grandfather, old Arthur, was sitting and listening to a crackling radio. Arthur was an 80-year-old man with hands gnarled and deformed by decades of heavy labor as a construction foreman. He could no longer walk well, his back bent by the weight of carrying cement and bricks all his life, but his eyes still shone with a sharp intelligence. Lily poured fresh coffee into a mug and sat next to him. They didn't have much, but they had each other. And they had the drawings. Since she was little, Lily showed a natural gift for understanding how things stood up. She didn't just see buildings. She saw skeletons, forces, balance. She drew on napkins, on pieces of cardboard, on the back of flyers. That night, after being humiliated by Richard, Lily was quiet. She opened her sketchbook, where she had tried to sketch a solution for the Infinity Foundation, the drawing Richard had thrown on the floor. Arthur noticed his granddaughter's sadness. With a raspy voice, he asked what had happened. Lily told him about the laughter, the contempt, the cruel words. Old Arthur listened in silence, shaking his head slowly. He knew that kind of man. He had worked for many of them. But then, Lily explained the technical problem. She grabbed a pencil and started drawing on the plastic tablecloth. She explained that the engineers wanted to pour massive amounts of concrete to create a rigid base, but the ground there was alive. There were shifting water tables. The solution, according to Lily's intuition, was not to fight the water, but to let it pass. To create a floating foundation, inspired by the roots of marshland trees, something she had seen in an old documentary and adapted using her grandfather's teachings on load distribution. Arthur looked at the drawing, adjusted his glasses, which were taped together at the bridge, and smiled. A smile of pure pride. He placed his hand on Lily's and said that a real engineer isn't the one with the diploma on the wall, but the one who listens to what the earth is asking. He told his granddaughter not to give up, because arrogance is a high wall, but every wall has a crack. Days passed, and the situation at the construction site worsened. The rain didn't stop, and a catastrophic leak occurred at the Infinity site, destroying weeks of work and putting neighboring structures at risk. Richard was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. He called an emergency meeting at the construction site itself at 2 a.m. It was pouring rain. There was mud everywhere, and the engineers in white hard hats and raincoats stared at the gigantic pit, clueless. Richard screamed, gestured, and threatened to sue everyone. It was in this chaos that the unthinkable began to take shape. Lily was there. As the night shift cleaner, she had been sent to help serve coffee and clean up the mud the bosses tracked into the command trailer. While pouring black coffee for a group of desperate engineers, Lily overheard the argument. They were talking about injecting more concrete, about creating barriers, but Lily knew that would only increase the hydrostatic pressure and cause the soil to collapse. Lily's heart raced. She remembered Richard's laughter. She remembered the humiliation, but she also remembered her grandfather's voice telling her to listen to the earth. In a burst of courage that only young dreamers possess, Lily slammed the coffee pot onto the table and said, with a trembling but firm voice, "That will burst the pipes on the street uptown. If you block the water, the pressure will blow out the neighbor's retaining wall." Silence fell over the trailer. Everyone looked at the cleaning girl. Richard, who had his back turned looking at a monitor, turned slowly. His eyes met Lily's. The anger on his face was visible. Who did she think she was? Richard opened his mouth to fire her right there, to kick her out. But before he could speak, one of the senior engineers, a tired and honest man, murmured, "The girl is right, Mr. Harrison. If we block it, the lateral pressure will triple. We hadn't calculated for the street above." Richard paused. He looked from Lily to the engineer and back to Lily. That girl, that nobody, had seen something a team of millionaires had missed. But Richard's arrogance was hard armor to break. He huffed, crossed his arms, and asked with a poisonous tone of challenge, "What do you suggest then, Jeannie? Are you going to perform magic with your mop?" Before we see the answer that changed everything, I want to ask you a quick question, heart to heart. Have you ever been underestimated by someone? Have you ever felt you had the answer but nobody wanted to hear your voice? If so, leave a "Yes, I have" here in the comments and subscribe to the channel. Because this story is here to show that your voice matters. Let's see how Lily reacted to this giant. Lily took a deep breath. She didn't have a computer. She didn't have the latest software. She picked up a red marker that was lying on a blueprint and went to the whiteboard on the trailer wall. With a steady hand, she drew. She didn't draw numbers. She drew shapes. She drew the structure she had discussed with her grandfather. A system of articulated footings that allowed the ground to move without breaking the structure, with drains that relieved the water pressure instead of repressing it. It was an old solution, almost forgotten, used in old bridges but adapted for a modern skyscraper. As she drew and explained, using simple terms but irrefutable logic, the atmosphere changed. The mocking smiles disappeared. The engineers began to step closer, whispering, nodding, grabbing their calculators. The solution was elegant, cheap, and above all, feasible. When Lily stepped away from the whiteboard, the trailer was silent. Not the awkward silence of the meeting room days ago, but a silence of respect, of awe. Richard looked at the board, hypnotized. He recognized that line. He recognized that logic. That wasn't something learned in a modern college. That was the knowledge of an old-school foreman, the kind who could smell rain before it fell. Richard walked to the board, ran his hand over the drawing, and then turned to Lily. The arrogance had given way to genuine confusion. "Where did you learn that?" Richard asked, his voice now just a whisper. Lily, still dirty with coffee stains and dust, raised her chin and replied, "From my grandfather. He was a foreman his whole life. His name is Arthur. Arthur Miller." The name hit Richard like a punch to the gut. He took a step back, needing to lean on the table. Memories flooded his mind like a broken dam. 30 years ago, Richard wasn't the millionaire of the Upper East Side. He was a young intern, hungry and ambitious, but directionless. And who had taken him in? Who had taught him to mix mortar, to lay the first brick, to respect the level? Arthur. His Arthur. The man who treated him like a son, who shared his sandwich with him, who taught him that construction was about sheltering lives, not just about profit. Richard had risen in life, blinded by money, and in his climb, he had turned his back on the past. He never looked for Arthur again. He was ashamed of his humble beginnings, and over time, ingratitude made him forget. Now, here was the granddaughter of his mentor, the girl he had humiliated, saving his biggest project with the wisdom of the man he had abandoned. Richard felt his legs go weak. He looked at Lily, and for the first time, he didn't see a cleaner. He saw himself as a young man. He saw Arthur's eyes. The shame he felt was overwhelming, greater than any financial loss. He dismissed the meeting with a vague gesture, telling everyone to leave except Lily. When they were alone, the arrogant millionaire collapsed into a plastic chair. He covered his face with his hands, and to Lily's surprise, his shoulders began to shake. Richard was crying, a mournful, painful cry of someone realizing he had built a castle on the sand of loneliness and ingratitude. Lily, not knowing what to do, just waited. Richard's humanity, buried for years under expensive suits and cold meetings, was surfacing. Richard lifted his face, eyes red, and asked for forgiveness. It wasn't a formal request from boss to employee. It was one man asking another human for forgiveness. He asked to meet Lily's grandfather. He needed to see Arthur. That same morning, Richard's armored luxury car, followed by his confused security team, entered the streets of Queens. The rain had slowed to a drizzle. When they stopped in front of the rusty gate of Lily's building, Richard hesitated. He was afraid of not being welcomed. But Lily opened the gate and invited him in. The reunion between Richard and Arthur didn't need many words, but it overflowed with emotion. Old Arthur, sitting in his worn-out armchair, looked at the man in the expensive Italian suit entering his humble kitchen. He showed no anger. The wisdom of age had long washed away any resentment. He just smiled that smile of someone who had seen it all and said, "Took you a while, didn't you, kid? I thought you'd forgotten the way home." Richard knelt beside the old foreman's armchair and wept like a child. There, on the linoleum floor, arrogance died, and the man was reborn. They talked until dawn. Richard spoke of the emptiness of his life, of fear, of loneliness. Arthur spoke of a simple life, of the peace of a duty fulfilled, of the pride he had in his granddaughter. The transformation that followed wasn't magic. It was built brick by brick as it should be. Richard didn't just give Lily money. He gave her a real opportunity. He paid for her college tuition, but insisted that Lily continue to intern at the sites, learning hands-on, getting her boots muddy so she would never lose her connection to reality. The Infinity Project was modified following Lily's idea. It was an absolute success, not just for its height, but for the sustainable innovation that became a global reference. But the biggest change wasn't in the building, it was in the builder. Time passed generously. 5 years later, Harrison Developments was no longer the same. The atmosphere in the corridors was different. Richard, now with gray hair and a lighter smile, greeted everyone by name, from the doorman to the director. He created a mentorship program for low-income youth called the Arthur Miller Institute, focused on discovering talent in the outer boroughs. Lily graduated with honors. At the graduation ceremony, Richard was there in the front row next to old Arthur, who wore his best suit, a little old-fashioned, but impeccable. When they called Lily's name, Richard stood up and applauded, tears in his eyes, feeling a pride he had never felt signing a billion-dollar contract. Lily didn't just become an engineer. She became Richard's right hand, and more importantly, his conscience. They worked together, debated projects, and often the best solutions didn't come from the glass room on the 50th floor, but from a kitchen table in Queens with fresh coffee and bagels. Richard learned that true success isn't measured by what you accumulate, but by what you build in the lives of others. He renovated Arthur's apartment but kept the simplicity the old man loved, only ensuring comfort and safety. The arrogance of that phrase, "You'll never get it, girl," was replaced by a motto now engraved at the entrance of the company headquarters: "Nobody builds anything alone." Richard realized that the girl he had despised was the one who saved not only his company, but his soul. He understood that material wealth without purpose is the greatest poverty of all. And Lily, with her humility and talent, proved that genius doesn't care about your zip code, and that often, the solutions to the world's most complex problems are in the hands of those who learn to respect nature and life. Today, when Richard looks at the city from the top of his buildings, he doesn't see just concrete and money. He sees stories. He sees people. And whenever he meets a nervous young person holding a folder of drawings or a crazy idea, he stops, smiles, and says, "Show me what you have. I want to learn from you." Because he knows that the unthinkable happens when we give talent the space to flourish, regardless of where it comes from. This is an educational story created to inspire and touch hearts. And you, what talent or dream have you kept hidden inside, waiting for just one opportunity to shine? Tell me, I really want to know your story. Thank you so much for your company until the end. A big hug, and until our next exciting story.